Hey guys, welcome to the Forum for Learning and to part 2 of lecture 2. In this video, we're going to answer these questions here. So we're going to talk about what a chemical bond is. We're going to talk about why atoms form chemical bonds. We'll talk about how chemical bonds form and how chemical reactions obey the laws of conservation of matter and conservation of energy. And we'll finish off by discussing what reversible and irreversible chemical reactions are. So without further ado, let's get started. What is a chemical bond, right? So a chemical bond is just an attractive force that links two atoms together. So it's an attractive force that links two atoms together. Okay, so chemical bonds form or they happen as a result of either the sharing of electrons between two atoms or the transfer of electrons between two atoms. So it occurs sort of as a so it happens as a result of sharing of electrons or the transfer of electrons. So when we talk about transfer, right, we mean that one atom loses one or more electrons while the other atom gains those electrons. Okay, so it's a complete transfer. It's one loses and the other gains. With respect to sharing of electrons, it's exactly that. It's two atoms will share those electrons. Okay, now when a chemical bond is made, it results in either the formation of molecules or compounds. So chemical bonds give rise to either molecules or compounds. So what are molecules and compounds, right? So a molecule is a chemical substance that's made up of two or more like or two or more different atoms that are joined by either covalent bonds or ionic interactions. So they are chemical substances, or substance, the chemical substance made up of two or more like, actually let me write it here, or different, so two or more like or different atoms joined by covalent bonds or ionic attractions. Okay, so so the key is here is that a molecule is made up of two or more like or different atoms. That's the key. It's the fact that it's either like or different atoms. Okay, and they're joined by covalent bonds or ionic attraction. So let's look at a couple of examples, right? So let's look at an example. So we have H2, which is the hydrogen molecule, right? Elemental hydrogen, elemental oxygen, O2. Water is a good example, as is carbon dioxide, right? And other ones obviously as well. Now if you look at hydrogen, elemental hydrogen and elemental oxygen, they're both made up of two identical atoms, right? So for example, elemental hydrogen, this guy here, it's made up of two hydrogen atoms. So they're made up of like, right? Two or more like atoms. But and same thing with oxygen, right? It's two or more like atoms because it's two oxygen atoms that are bonded together. Now if you look at water, you have two different atoms, right? So two different atoms. Same thing with carbon dioxide. So again, a molecule is a chemical substance that's made up of two or more like or different atoms that are joined by covalent bonds or ionic attractions. Now, with respect to compounds, so a compound is a pure substance. Okay, so pure substance, it's made up of two or more different atoms bonded together in a fixed ratio. So it's a pure substance made up of two or more different atoms bonded together in a fixed ratio. Okay, now here it's with respect to different atoms, right? So let's look at examples. So from the previous example of hydrogen, element of oxygen, water, and carbon dioxide, compounds, the compounds within that section are going to be water, carbon dioxide, another one would be sodium chloride, so table salt, and etc. So here, a compound is strictly a substance made up of two or more different atoms. Okay, so now an important distinction needs to be made with respect to compounds and molecules, and it's that all compounds are molecules, but not all molecules are compounds. Now, why is that? Again, compounds refer to two or more different atoms bonded together, whereas a molecule can consist of either two or more different atoms bonded together or two or more like atoms bonded together. So in that case, so all the compounds are molecules, whereas a molecule may or may not be a compound. If it's a molecule that's made up of two different atoms, sure, it's a compound. But if it's a molecule made of two like atoms, it's not a compound, right? So hopefully you guys can understand that. So again, so just a distinction, all compounds are molecules, but not all molecules are compounds. Okay, so again, all compounds are molecules, so all compounds are molecules, but not all molecules are compounds. Okay, so we discussed what a chemical bond is, and we discussed that they give rise to molecules and compounds. We define molecule and define compounds. So now let's talk about why do atoms form chemical bonds, right? So, okay, so why do atoms form chemical bonds? Well, the main reason is to satisfy the octet rule. So why do atoms form bonds, right? Chemical bonds. And it's to satisfy the octet rule. Now, if you guys don't know what the octet rule is, check out part 1 of lecture 2. We go into detail as to what that is. And so I'm not really going to go into that here because we already mentioned that in part 1 of lecture 2. So I'd suggest you guys watch that if you guys want to have a better understanding. Okay, so again, so atoms form bonds to satisfy the octet rule. So bonding, right, so chemical bonds, they allow atoms that have incomplete valence shells to fill the valence shell completely, right? So most atoms that do bond, they tend to have incompletely filled valence shells. Okay, and in order to fill those valence shells to satisfy that octet rule, atoms are going to go bond. And then this chemical bonding is going to then allow them to be able to fill the valence shell completely. All right, so why do atoms form bonds? So it's bonding allows atoms with incompletely filled valence shells to fill them completely. And as you mentioned in part 1 of lecture 2, completely filled valence shell confers stability, right? So by bonding and consequently completely filling the valence shell, the atom gains stability. Okay, so that's pretty much the main reason as to why atoms want to bond with other atoms. It's an attempt to completely fill their valence shell and then gain stability. Okay, so again, if you guys want more information regarding the octet rule and regarding valence shells and all that, I suggest you guys check out part 1 of lecture 2, where we talk about that in detail. All right, so now we discussed what chemical bonds were. We discussed why atoms form chemical bonds. So now let's discuss how chemical bonds form. Okay, so how do chemical bonds form, right? So how do chemical bonds form? And chemical bonds form through chemical reactions. Okay, chemical reactions. So what are chemical reactions, right? Chemical reactions occur when two or more atoms bond together to form molecules, or when a molecule or bonded pair of atoms break apart. So they occur when two or more atoms bond together to form molecules or compounds, right? Molecules, or when a molecule or bonded atoms break apart. So in other words, chemical reactions are what cause the formation of molecules, or rather, chemical reactions are the process by which molecules form, or also by the process by which molecules break apart. Okay, so with respect to the first type of reactions, the formation of molecule reactions, so let's write that. So when forming molecules, a chemical reaction occurs when moving atoms collide with enough energy enough energy to combine and form a molecule. Okay, so when forming molecules, a chemical reaction occurs only when the moving atoms collide with enough energy to then combine and form molecules. Okay, but we have the other type of reactions where we also have the breaking apart of molecules, right? So you have two sort of different types of reactions, but they're all chemical reactions. Okay, so let's look at an example of a chemical reaction. So let's look at an example reaction over here. So look at the formation of water. Okay, so we have, so in this reaction, this chemical reaction in the formation of water, we have two hydrogen molecules plus an oxygen molecule, and that's going to yield two water molecules. Okay, so let's talk about the different parts of this reaction, or this reaction equation, right? So in this part, these are what's called the reactants. Right, the reactants of the reaction. Now this guy right here is the product of the reaction. Okay, and this arrow here represents the reaction direction. Okay, all right, so now we also have to talk about the numbers that are here. So let's change this to blue, and actually let's change it to red, and let's look at the first set of numbers. So if you look, there are numbers in front of each of the molecules, right? And these guys are called the coefficients of a reaction. Okay, and we also have another set of numbers here that we'll talk about in blue. That's right here. 1, 2, and 3. These guys are called the subscripts. Okay, so let's talk about each of them a bit more in detail, right? So let's talk about the reactants and the product. So the reactants of a reaction are the substances that are present at the beginning of a reaction. Okay, so it's the substances that are present at the beginning of a reaction. Now, products are the opposite. So products are the substances that are present at the end of a reaction. Okay, now generally speaking, in a reaction equation, the reactants are going to be on the left side of the equation, or the left side of the arrow. Now the products are going to be on the right side of the arrow, and that makes sense because here, for example, the reactants are on the left side of this arrow, right? They're on the left side of this arrow. The product is on the right side of this arrow here. Okay, and now something important to note with respect to products, especially, or products and reactants really, but products, is that the products, so which are the substances that are present at the end of a reaction, can have vastly different properties than that of the reactants. So in this example here, water, which is a product of this reaction, has quite a bit different properties to that of elemental hydrogen and elemental oxygen, which are the reactants, right? So it's not always, they're not always, so the product isn't always going to have similar properties and characteristics to that of the reactant. So they can have very different properties. Okay, so that's something important to note. Now let's move on to reaction direction. So the reaction direction is the arrow that's drawn between the reactants and products, and it determines the direction of the reaction. So the arrow between reactants and products determines the direction of that reaction. So in this case, the arrow is drawn between the reactants and the product, so it's going to be, the reactants are going to get used up to form the product, right? So the arrow is going to determine which direction the reaction proceeds. Okay, and it's generally from the reactants to the products, right? But now something important to note is that not all reactions are going to be unidirectional, meaning not all reactions are just going to go from reactants to products. So not all reactions are going to be unidirectional. And we'll talk about that in a little bit in this video. We'll talk about bidirectional reactions and unidirectional reactions later in this video. So we discussed reactants, we discussed products, we discussed the reaction direction. So now let's look at the numbers, right? Let's talk about the numbers. So let's talk about coefficients first. So let's put it in red because we highlighted it in red. So the coefficients of a reaction. So what are the coefficients? The coefficients are the numbers that precede the molecular formulas, right? So that's why they come before, right here, right here, right here. There's a 2 here. Now there's nothing there, so you can assume there's just a 1, right? And there's a 2 here, right? So these are numbers that precede the molecular formulas, and they indicate the number of each reactant that is used up in a reaction and the number of each product that is produced in a chemical reaction. So coefficients are the numbers that precede molecular formulas, and they indicate the number of reactants and products used up and produced respectively in a given chemical reaction. Okay, so they represent the number of reactants that are used up in a reaction and the number of products that are produced in a given chemical reaction. Okay, and it's a number of each reactant and each product. All right, so that's the coefficient. Now, with respect to, what was the other one? The other one was the guys on the that come after the molecular formulas, right? So that's, or the elemental symbol rather, and those guys are the subscripts. So what are the subscripts? So let's talk about subscripts. So the subscript is they're the small numbers that come after the elemental symbol. Okay, so it's the numbers that come after the elemental symbol. Meanwhile, the coefficients are the numbers that precede the molecular formulas, right? They come before the molecular formulas. Here, subscripts, they come after the elemental symbol. Okay, and they represent the number of atoms in a particular molecule and or a particular compound. So they represent the number of atoms in a particular molecule or compound. Okay, so that's what a subscript is. The difference is that coefficients, they come before molecular formulas. So if you look, this guy right here only has one coefficient, right? So each reactant will have a single coefficient because it represents they represent the number of, the number of each reactant and each product. So number of each reactant and each product, right? Whereas the coefficients, they represent the number of atoms of a particular molecule, right? So the number of atoms present in a particular molecule. So they represent the number of atoms in a particular molecule or compound. Okay, and they're there. So here you have, there's going to be one subscript per elemental symbol. So here, if you look at H2O, you have a 2 for hydrogen, and since there's nothing there, that means that there's still a 1 because there's 1 oxygen, right? So let's look at what we mean by coefficient subscript. So let's look at here. So let's look at the coefficient here. What this is saying is that there are 2 molecules of hydrogen that are used up in this reaction. And there's one molecule of oxygen used up in this reaction, and it produces 2 molecules of water. That's the coefficient, right? So it's telling you how many reactants are used, how many of each of the reactants are used up, how many of each of the products are produced. Now, with respect to subscript, it's telling you how many atoms of that element are present in that molecule. So here we have hydrogen molecule, or molecular hydrogen, and that's made up of 2 atoms of hydrogen. And this one molecule of oxygen has 2 atoms of oxygen atoms. So one molecule of oxygen has 2 oxygen atoms. Whereas if you look at it over here, this reaction produces 2 molecules of water, but within the molecule of water, it has 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, right? So hopefully that clears up the distinction between coefficients and subscripts. Now, subscripts give rise to something important called molecular weight, right? So what's molecular weight? So in part 1 of lecture 2, we discussed atomic number, mass number, and atomic weight, right? So if you guys are not familiar with any of those, I suggest you check out part 1 of lecture 2, okay? But now we're going to talk about molecular weight. So what's molecular weight? So molecular weight is the sum of the atomic weights of all the atoms, actually let me write that below, of all the atoms that are present in a molecule or compound. Okay, so let's look at an example, right? So let's look at how do we calculate the molecular weight of water. So let's do that. So do an example here. Of water, right? So let's look at H2O. So one molecule of hydrogen, of water has what? You have 2 hydrogen atoms in a single water molecule, and you have 1 oxygen atom, right? So you have a single oxygen atom and 2 hydrogen atoms. So in order to calculate the molecular weight, because molecular weight is the sum of the atomic weights of all the atoms present in a molecule, you have to figure out what the atomic weights of each of these are, and that's found within the periodic table. So hydrogen has an atomic weight about 1 gram, and oxygen has a atomic weight of about 16 grams. So the molecular weight of water is just 2 grams plus 16 grams, total of 18 grams. So that's the molecular weight of water. So again, it's the sum of the atomic weights of each of the atoms present in a molecule. Okay, so in water, there's only really 2 types of atoms present, hydrogen atom and an oxygen atom, but there are 2 hydrogen atoms present. So you have to take the atomic weight of hydrogen and multiply by 2, and there's only 1 oxygen atom present in water, so you take the atomic weight of oxygen and you times it by 1, you add those 2 together and you get 18 grams. That's molecular weight. Okay, so far we've discussed what a chemical bond is, we discussed what molecules and compounds are, we discussed why atoms form chemical bonds, we also discussed how chemical bonds form through chemical reactions, so we discussed chemical reactions, and we discussed all of the different aspects of a typical chemical reaction formula, right? So we talked about what reactants are, products are, the direction of the reaction, and coefficient, subscript, and then also talked about molecular weight. So now let's talk about how chemical reactions, how do they obey the laws of conservation of matter and conservation of energy. So let's talk about that. So so conservation of energy rather I should say conservation of matter and energy. So regardless of the type of reaction, matter and energy are always conserved. Okay, so that's the important thing. So regardless of the type of reaction, matter and energy are always conserved. Okay, that's the important thing. So let's talk about the conservation or the law of conservation of matter first, and then we'll talk about the law of conservation of energy and how, reactions obey both. Okay, so let's talk law of conservation of matter. Okay, so what's the law of conservation of matter? The law of conservation of matter states that the number of atoms before and after a chemical reaction should be equal, such that no atoms are created or destroyed. Okay, so it states that the number of atoms present before and after a chemical reaction should be equal, such that no atoms, in other words, matter, right? Because atoms are the fundamental unit of matter, so that no atoms are created or destroyed. So how do we tell that a reaction is obeying the law of conservation of matter with respect to a reaction formula, right? Like we just mentioned, we just looked at over here with respect to this thing right here. So how can we tell? Well, we can tell by making sure that the reaction is balanced, right? So the reaction equation is balanced on the reactant side and on the product side. So let's look at an example. Let's look at the example we talked about over here with respect to the formation of water. I'll rewrite it over here, okay? So the formation of water. So example, okay, so we have 2 molecules of hydrogen plus 1 molecule of oxygen gives rise to 2 molecules of water. Okay, so let's take apart the reactant side and let's take apart the product side. So the reactant side. Okay, so how many hydrogen atoms do we have? We have a total of 4 hydrogen atoms, right? Because you have a coefficient of 2, which means that there's 2 hydrogen molecules. Now within each hydrogen molecule has a subscript of 2, which means there are 2 atoms per molecule of hydrogen. And in this specific reaction, we're using 2 molecules of hydrogen. So 2 times 2 is 4 hydrogen atoms. Okay? Now on the other side, we have a single molecule of oxygen, but within that molecule of oxygen, you have 2 oxygen atoms. So you have, let's write this hydrogen. And so you have just 2 oxygen atoms. Okay, so now let's look at the product side. Here we have 2 molecules of water, but within each molecule of water we have 2 hydrogen atoms and a single oxygen atom, right? So here we have a total of, so wait, let's try product. We have again 4 hydrogen atoms, and we have 2 oxygen atoms from 2 molecules of water containing 1 atom of oxygen each, right? So 2 oxygen atoms. So if you look, we have 4 hydrogen atoms, 4 hydrogen atoms, 2 oxygen atoms, 2 oxygen atoms. So this reaction is balanced, right? So, and the reason it's balanced is because they all equal each other. The number of hydrogen atoms on the reactant side equals the number of hydrogen atoms on the product side. The number of oxygen atoms on the reactant side, it equals the number of oxygen atoms in the product side. So you have a balanced equation, reaction equation, right? Which means that matter is conserved, because no new atoms are created, right? So no atoms are created, or nor are they destroyed. So here we have equal atoms on either side. So we have balanced equation, which gives which lets us know that this reaction follows the law of conservation of matter, and this is the case for all reactions, regardless of the type of reaction. Matter and energy are always conserved. Okay, so that was law of conservation of matter and how reactions obey that, right? Now let's talk about the law of conservation of energy. Okay, so the law of conservation of energy, right? So similar to the law of conservation of matter, so the law of conservation of energy. So the law of conservation of energy states that in chemical reactions do not create or destroy energy, but changes in the form of energy is possible. Okay, so it states that chemical reactions do not create or destroy energy, but changes in the form of energy can occur in chemical reactions. Okay, so remember, in the law of conservation of matter, we said that atoms, in other words, matter, is never created or destroyed in chemical reactions, right? In this similar vein, chemical reactions do not create or destroy energy, but changes in the form of energy can occur. That's the important thing. So what's energy, right? So energy is just the ability to do work. That's energy. And energy can exist in various different forms. So you can have potential energy, you can have thermal, chemical, kinetic energy, and so on and so forth. But the key to the law of conservation of energy is that chemical reactions cannot create or destroy energy, but that changes in the form of energy can take place. So let's look at an example, right? Let's look at an example to talk about what we mean. So in this example that we're looking at is the combustion reaction that takes place in an internal combustion engine. So like pretty much your gasoline engine, right? That's in your car. So let's look at that reaction. So we have fuel in the form of octane, which is C8H18, and we have 2 of those. And we have oxygen, and that yields carbon dioxide plus water and energy. Okay, so this is a typical reaction that takes place in your gasoline engine, right? Of your gasoline-powered car. So first, before we talk about law of conservation of energy and see whether energy is conserved in this reaction, let's practice and see if the law of conservation of matter is abided by this reaction. So in other words, let's see if this reaction is balanced, right? So here are the reactants, and here are the products, right? So let's see how many carbon atoms are there in the reactant side. So we have 8 carbon atoms in octane, and we have 2 molecules of octane, so we have a total of 16 carbon atoms. How many hydrogen atoms do we have? Well, we have 18 hydrogen atoms present in a sample of octane, and we have 2 molecules of octane, so 2 times 18 is 36 hydrogen molecules. And we have how many oxygen? Well, we have 25 molecules of oxygen, and within each molecule of oxygen we have 2 oxygen atoms, so we have 50 atoms of oxygen, right? So 50 oxygen. So now what happens in the product side? Let's do in the product side. How many carbons do we have? Well, we have 16 carbons 16 molecules of carbon dioxide, and within each molecule of carbon dioxide we have one carbon atom. So we have a total of 16 carbon atoms. With respect to hydrogen, we have two atoms of hydrogen in every molecule of water, and we have 18 molecules of water. So 18 times 2 is 36 hydrogen molecules. Now, with respect to oxygen, we have oxygen found within carbon dioxide and water, right? So within a molecule of carbon dioxide, we have 2 oxygen atoms, and there's 16 molecules of carbon dioxide. So there's 16 times 2, right? Two molecules, or 2 atoms of oxygen in each molecule of carbon dioxide, and 16 of them, so 16 times 2. Plus, we have a single atom of oxygen in a molecule of water, but there's 18 molecules of water, so that's 18. That's 18 times 1. So we have a total of 32 plus 18, and that gives us 50. 50 oxygen. 15 oxygen atoms. Do we have conservation of matter? Well, we have 16 carbon atoms here, 16 carbon atoms here, 36 hydrogen atoms, 36 hydrogen atoms, 50 oxygen atoms, 50 oxygen atoms. So we can say that the law of conservation of matter has been met, right? So here is the reaction is balanced. So now let's look at it from the lens of the law of conservation of energy. Now, if you look at this reaction, it may seem that the law of conservation of energy has not been abided by, and that energy is not conserved, because energy has been, it may seem as though energy has been created in this reaction, right? Because you don't have energy in the reactant side, but you have energy in the product side. So that may make us believe that energy was created. But what actually happens is that, well, yes, energy in this reaction, energy is released. In this reaction, right? Because you have energy on the product side, so energy has been released. But it's not energy has not been created. What actually happens is that the energy that's released in this reaction, so that the energy that's on the product side, comes from the energy that is stored within the bonds of fuel, the chemical bonds of fuel, and the chemical bonds of the oxygen molecule. So it's actually a classic case of the energy has changed form. So the energy released in this reaction comes from the energy stored within the chemical bonds of octane and molecular oxygen. Okay? And this energy, this energy that's stored within the chemical bonds is called potential chemical energy. And potential chemical energy is the potential energy that's stored within chemical bonds. So what's actually happening here in this reaction is that the reaction, in this reaction, energy isn't created, but rather the form of energy has changed from the potential chemical energy found within the covalent bonds of fuel and of oxygen, and it's liberated, and it changes form into thermal energy that's found within the product side of this reaction, right? So in this reaction, energy isn't created, but rather the energy, or the form of energy rather, has changed from potential chemical energy to thermal energy. Right, so in that regard, because it's energy that has changed form, this reaction here, this reaction abides by the law of conservation of energy. Because again, the law of conservation of energy says that reactions cannot create or destroy energy, but changes in the form of energy can occur. And that's what's happened here. It may seem as though energy is being created, but that's not the case, because again, the energy that's released, that's on the product side, which is thermal energy, was stored, or was found stored within the chemical bonds of the reactants. So it's actually that there was a change in the form of energy from potential chemical energy in the reactants to thermal energy that's being released in the reaction. Okay, so in this case, again, the law of conservation of matter is met, as well as the law of conservation of energy is also met. Okay, and that's the case for every reaction. All right. Okay, so now we have to talk about the fact that not all reactions are going to release energy. Right? In this case, yeah, sure, energy was released, but not all reactions are gonna release energy. In fact, some reactions may require it. And if a reaction requires energy, then that means that you're going to find energy on the reactant side, right? So if a reaction releases energy, it's going to be on the product side. If a reaction requires energy, it'll be found within the reactant side. Okay. Now, a unique sort of thing about biological systems is that in many cases, the reactions that release energy can be maybe coupled or linked to reactions that require energy. So there's a series of reactions that occur where one set of reactions will release the energy, and that energy will go to be used for reactions that require energy, and then so on. So we'll talk about sort of biological reactions in later lectures, but that's just something to kind of keep in mind, so that not all reactions will release energy. Not all reactions may require energy. Some may release, some may require, and in many cases, or in some cases rather, reactions that release energy can be coupled or linked to reactions that require energy. Okay? Okay, so now let's talk about reversible and irreversible reactions. Okay, so let's just talk on a different page. Okay, so let's discuss. So first we'll talk about irreversible reactions, and then we'll talk about reversible. So alright, so what are irreversible reactions? Irreversible reactions are reactions that proceed in one direction until all the reactants turn into products. In other words, until all the reactants get used up. So irreversible reactions are reactions that proceed in one direction until all the reactants turn into products. Okay? And this type of reaction, so irreversible reactions, are represented by a unidirectional arrow. So represented by a unidirectional arrow. So something like that, right? And we've seen irreversible reactions here. So if you look at the reactions like this, this would be considered an irreversible reaction because the arrow is pointing to one direction, right? Which means that all of the reactants are going to be used up to form the products, and the reaction is going to proceed until all the reactants get used up. Okay, and the same thing with water. Again, it's a unidirectional arrow, which means that all of the reactants are going to get used up to form the products. So that's what an irreversible reaction is. Okay, so now let's talk about what reversible reactions are. So what's a reversible reaction? So a reversible reaction is a reaction that can proceed in both directions. So reversible reactions are reactions that can proceed in both directions. And these guys, the reversible reactions, are represented by a bidirectional arrow. So they are represented by a bidirectional arrow because, again, they can proceed in both directions. And this sort of looks like, you'll see two sort of common symbols. One is this, which is a double-headed arrow, or you'll also see this, where it's two arrows stacked on each other, indicating a reversible reaction. Okay, so what actually happens in a reversible reaction? So first, what happens is, so initially the reactants will turn to products. Then at a certain point, the products will convert back to reactants. Okay, and in this process, the products of the forward reaction become the reactants of the reverse reaction, right? Because it's flipped now. And the reactants of the forward reaction become the products of the reverse reaction, again, because the reaction is flipped, right? Then the reverse reaction will proceed until the products, so the reactants of the forward reaction, they will proceed until the product concentration reaches a certain amount, and the products of the reverse reaction will convert back to reactants. So in other words, that was a whole confusing spiel, right? So let's just sort of diagram it. So first, what happens is you have the forward reaction, right? Then eventually, at a certain point, the products will convert back to reactants. So which means that it's going to go into the reverse reaction. And that's going to happen until the reaction switches again into the forward reaction. And then we're going to get back to the reverse reaction. And this will alternate. The series of forward to reverse to forward to reverse will alternate until you reach a point called an equilibrium. So this will happen. So this sequence of switching back between forward and reverse reactions will occur. So let's write that. So the forward and reverse reactions will alternate until an equilibrium is reached. So what is an equilibrium? So an equilibrium is the point at which the rate of the forward reaction equals the rate of the reverse reaction. So the point at which the rate of the forward reaction equals the rate of the reverse reaction. Okay, so it's the rates of the forward reaction equaling the rates of the reverse reaction. So in other words, at equilibrium, there's a certain relative balance that's reached between the reactants and the products. Okay, so let's talk about an example of a reversible reaction. So let's look at that. So an example. So in this example, we're going to talk about the pH buffer system in human blood. Okay? Alright, so let's look at this reaction. So we have what's called bicarbonate, HCO3 minus, plus a hydrogen ion, H plus, and we have carbonic acid, H2CO3. Right, so again, it's a reverse reaction because we have the bidirectional arrow, right? Okay, so here what's going to happen first, we're going to have HCO3 minus combined with H plus to form H2CO3. Okay, so we have, so first HCO3 minus and H plus will combine to form H2CO3, right? And this again is the forward reaction. All right, then once the concentration of carbonic acid of H2CO3 reaches a certain point, it'll then break down into bicarbonate and the hydrogen ion. So when the concentration of carbonic acid H2CO3 reaches a certain point or a certain amount, when it reaches a certain amount, it H2CO3 breaks down to HCO3 minus and H plus. And this is a reverse reaction. And again, this reverse reaction will proceed until the concentration of HCO3 minus and H plus gets to a point where they'll recombine to form H2CO3. Right? So the two reactions will alternate until an equilibrium is finally reached. And so when equilibrium is reached, what happens? The rate of formation of H2CO3, which is again the forward reaction, will equal the rate of breakdown of H2CO3, or the reverse reaction. Right? So, well, and the breakdown of this obviously leads to formation of HCO3 minus and H plus. Right? So so to just kind of go over it again, the forward reaction is going to proceed until it gets to a point where the product concentration gets to a point where it's too much. Then what's going to happen? The products are going to break down and form reactants again. And so in that reaction, the product becomes the reactant. The product of the forward reaction becomes the reactant of the reverse reaction, and the reactants of the forward reaction become the products of the reverse reaction. And then it's going to switch. Right? So they're going to keep switching until it gets to a point where the rate of the forward reaction, which is the formation of carbonic acid, H2CO3, equals the rate of the breakdown of carbonic acid, H2CO3, which is a reverse reaction. Right? So the rates are going to equal, and so now you're going to have some sort of stable, certain relative balance that is reached between the reactants and the products. Now, this can shift, right? So, if, for example, if we add more bicarbonate, more HC3O3, what's going to happen? It's going to shift this way, right? Because now the concentration is a bit too high. So now it's going to combine with this and form this. So you can shift the equilibrium to the right by adding more reactants, and just like that, you can you can shift the equilibrium to the reverse reaction by adding more of H2CO3, right? And so you can play with it. And so that's what a reverse reaction is. And sort of the distinction between reverse reaction and a reversible reaction and irreversible reactions. Alright, that's it for this video. Let's just double check that we covered everything that we were supposed to and answered all the questions. We defined what a chemical bond is. We talked about why atoms form chemical bonds, because remember the octet rule and trying to fill their valence shells. We talked about how chemical bonds form through reactions, and we talked about how reactions obey the laws of conservation of matter and the law of conservation of energy regardless of the type of reaction. And we finished off by discussing what were reversible and irreversible chemical reactions. So we talked about pretty much all of them. Yeah, right? Okay. All right, so that's it for this video. That's it for part 2 of lecture 2. I hope you guys learned something. And stay tuned for the remaining parts of lecture 2. And as always, stay true, be kind, never stop learning. And that's it for this one, guys. So, as always, okay, bye.